Hi everyone, my name is Laura Wisse, and today I'll be giving a demonstration on the segmentation of the whole hippocampus and the hippocampal subfield dentate gyrus on T2-weighted MRI. If you haven't done so already, I would recommend that you first watch my other tutorials on whole hippocampal anatomy and hippocampal subfield anatomy. And before I get started, I want to point out that there are actually quite a large number of different segmentation protocols. So what I'll try to do today is to show you a bit more of a general segmentation and point out where the differences are between the segmentation protocols. So what you see here is a MRI scan, a whole brain MRI, and this is a coronal plane, and this is a T2-weighted MRI scan where the white matter is actually darker than the gray matter and the cerebral spinal fluid is actually more bright. So what I'll do now is zoom into the left hippocampus here, and I'll actually go to a more anterior location. So this is more or less the anterior tip of the hippocampus, and it's bordered here by the amygdala and here by the entorhinal cortex. So I would personally actually not start segmenting the hippocampus this far anterior. I would actually go to a more posterior place. For example, this place. So I took this place because the uncal region is actually no longer connected to the amygdala, which you can see here. And you can see that they're separated by some slightly more brighter voxels here. They're not quite as bright as these voxels, probably because of partial voluming. So in this slice, the hippocampus is bordered by white matter here, cerebral spinal fluid. Should point out this is the choroid plexus, which actually looks quite a lot like the gray matter of the hippocampus, but fortunately this outer layer of the hippocampus is white matter and it's called the alveus. This can help you separate the choroid plexus from the hippocampus. And on this end, the hippocampus is actually continuous with the entorhinal cortex. So the way I would draw the border is, and this I would normally do in my mind, but to point it out, I would outline the gray matter here and I would pick the most medial point here, and that would be my border between the subiculum subfield and the entorhinal cortex. So the subiculum is one of the subfields of the hippocampus. So this is actually one of the borders that differs between segmentation protocols. And I generally pick this border because it's easily identifiable and I can very consistently find this border in different subjects. But I'm not necessarily arguing that this is anatomically the best border. So here I'm drawing the border with the white matter, with the CSF, where I'm actually trying not to include the alveus, so this white matter structure here. And actually that's also one of the things that can differ between protocols. Some protocols actually include this in the hippocampus label. So going one slice further anterior, what you can see here is that the uncal region is actually continuous with the amygdala here. So the way I would draw the border in this slice, I would try and outline the amygdala. Ignore this portion, but outlining the amygdala, and then everything inferior or kind of inferior medial would be in the hippocampus label. And I think again, this is one of the places where segmentation protocols differ. And again, I choose this border because it's something that I can easily identify. But I want to point out that you're probably, if you're doing it like this, you're probably including some of the hippocampus amygdala transitional areas in the hippocampus label. So again, I would pick the most medial border here, which is approximately here. So going one slice further anterior, again, if you would outline the amygdala, it's more or less like this. So everything below would be in the hippocampus label. This is more or less the most medial point. And this is a vessel. And I think the border here, this is much darker than this, so that's not very difficult to identify. So going one slice further anterior, again, this is the amygdala, so I would more or less draw the border like in this location. And this is more or less the most medial point of the cortex, so that would be my border with the entorhinal cortex. So what you maybe see here is that I'm not, by just drawing an outline, I'm not necessarily perfectly excluding all alveus voxels or including all gray matter voxels that I want. So normally what I do is I would first outline the hippocampus on each slice, and then after that I would go in and try to edit it on every slice. So I wouldn't necessarily edit right after I drew the outline. So going one slice further anterior, again, if you draw the amygdala border, it's more or less like this. So that would be my border with the hippocampus. And same here. And what you see here actually is that this most medial portion of the amygdala seems to be more or less attached to the hippocampus. But the alveus is really helpful here to separate amygdala from hippocampus. Same thing here, most medial point of the cortex. Border with the white matter, and then here border with the CSF. And then border with the amygdala. Same thing for the next slice. I'm actually thinking I'm over segmenting here. I think this is some partial voluming, so I'm gonna exclude those voxels. So same thing for next slice, finding the most medial point of the cortex, then outlining the border of the hippocampus here. And then what I see here actually is that the hippocampus is completely surrounded by white matter. So this is actually a point where I would no longer include this in the hippocampus label. And I would only include this portion. So I'm actually not sure how other protocols make this transition from including this more medial portion here to something that's completely surrounded by the white matter. But this is the way I generally do it. So up to the point where the hippocampus is continuous with the entorhinal cortex, I include all of this, and then the next slice I don't. So, and then here, I think this might still be some hippocampal voxels. So actually, if you paste the outline on the previous slide, you can see that these voxels are probably right in the middle of that outline. So I'm gonna outline them here, and then just to check, I'm gonna go again back to that posterior slice. What you can see here, that it falls right in the middle. So I think this is probably going to be hippocampus. So this is how I would outline it. And then one slice further anterior, I don't see it anymore. So I think in general, especially with these more anterior slices, it might be helpful to outline and then go back and forth between slices to make sure that these last voxels really are part of the hippocampus. So if something that you would see in this slice looks like this, I'm just making this up now. And then if you would go to the more posterior slice, it sticks out on this end. And I think that would be very unlikely to happen from this outline to this outline in the next slice, so I think then this wouldn't be hippocampus. But given that this falls right in the middle here, I think this is probably going to be hippocampus, especially since we know this label is going to be smaller and smaller on each consecutive anterior slice. So now I want to go back to the first slice that I segmented and go in a more posterior direction. So again, the hippocampus is bordered by white matter here, cerebral spinal fluid here. And again, this is the choroid plexus. I think this is also cerebral spinal fluid, even though it looks a bit darker because of partial voluming. And then again, the border with the entorhinal cortex, I place at the most medial point of the cortex here. Okay. Same thing here. Same thing here, the most medial point of the cortex, the border with the white matter, the border with the CSF. And again, this is a vessel, and I think this is much darker, so that's the border between these two. So one slice further posterior. And I actually think this looks actually like the gray matter, but I think that's cerebral spinal fluid, and I think this is the alveus, so that's why I picked that border. And I think this is just partial voluming makes this look darker than these CSF voxels. Okay. So I think this is also alveus. So that's what's guiding my segmentation. And the uncal region is actually becoming smaller. Same thing here. I think these are alveus voxels which guide my outline. And then I think potentially this could still be the uncal region. It's very small. So it falls right here in the middle of that outline, or within that outline, I should say. So this could potentially still be uncal voxels. It's very small though, so I would say I would just recommend making a decision for each subject, like if you still want to segment this as uncus, and then if you do, be sure to do that consistently between subjects. There are oftentimes some of these ambiguous slices where you're not 100% sure if you should segment it or not, so I would just try. I think the most important thing is to try to be consistent between subjects. So I think for me, I think this is sufficient to still segment, so I would segment it here. And then here I would segment the rest of the hippocampus. And then on the next slice, there's no uncal label here anymore. So this would be, let me try that again. This would be the hippocampal body. And what I want to point out here is that this is fimbria, that a region that I also not including in the hippocampus label, and this I think is the choroid plexus. So going further posterior, I actually already outlined the other hippocampal body slices. Okay, so we're now pretty far posterior, so again I would take the most medial point of the cortex here. posterior direction, same outline. You can start to see that the typical shape of the body is starting to disappear, so it becomes a bit different. See a bit more of these dentations or digitations here. Even more so here. Same thing here. And I think this is actually part of the hippocampus as well. It's continuous with this portion. And it's actually looks very similar on the next slide, so that's further confirming that that is part of the hippocampus. And again, I keep using this most medial portion here of the gray matter as my border. Again, also in these more posterior locations of the hippocampus, that's not necessarily a border that everybody uses, but I find it very easy to find and to use consistently. So that's why I keep using this all the way to the posterior end. Same thing here. So the hippocampus becomes smaller. And then here, I'm not so sure if I see it anymore. So I generally, for the end of the hippocampus, I look more at this portion than at this portion. So here it seems to have disappeared. You can maybe see some traces of it still, but I don't think I would segment hippocampal tail on this slice. So as I already mentioned, normally what I would do is then go through each slice and then see if I missed some gray matter voxels, those are the lighter voxels surrounding the outline, or see if I over segmented some voxels. For example, if a voxel looks darker. And it generally helps to use the S. With the S I can turn on and off the segmentation, so you can check if your segmentation looks okay. For example, I would not include these white matter voxels here in the label. So that's how I would go through each slide and then edit the segmentation. But for now, I'm just gonna stick with what I already have and then move on to the dentate gyrus. So again, the dentate gyrus is generally surrounded by a white matter structure or layer called stratum radiatum lacunosum moleculare, or SRLM. And we also often refer to this as the dark band, as this is a dark band that appears inside the hippocampus on these T2-weighted MRI scans. So you can see it right here. So that would be your border between the dentate gyrus and surrounding other subfields. So I will actually label this with blue. So I will just follow this dark band here. And what helps actually is also look at the outer boundary, because generally the dark band follows kind of the same curvature. And I think here actually it's not super clear, but I think this is the rest of the dark band here. You can see the alveus go inwards here, and you can see the gray matter kind of wrapping around that. So I think this is your dark band. And in cases where it can be hard to find, it can be helpful to infer, for example, thickness of adjacent locations. So for example, the thickness of the gray matter is about this width, so I'm expecting it to be a similar width very close by. So that's why I think this is probably all alveus, or SRLM voxels. So that's why I think this is the outline. I do want to point out that the thickness of these surrounding regions is not necessarily the same in every place. So it can be a bit thicker here inferior and lateral, and then it's often a bit thinner in these more superior regions. But it can be helpful to infer the location of SRLM based on the thickness of this CA region here. So going to one slice anterior, again, this is the dark band. And again, I'm following, also looking at the curvature on the outside. And then I think this is the border. So what I should have mentioned already actually is that I generally don't start segmenting in the most anterior tip of the dentate gyrus, but I start in a location such as this slice where I can see the dark band pretty well, because that's an easier starting point, and then working my way further anterior. And another thing that I should point out is that I'm now kind of trying to go through the middle of this dark band. And so I kind of split the dark band between the dentate gyrus label and the label of the surrounding regions. But there are actually quite a large number of differences or different approaches between segmentation protocols. So some included in the dentate gyrus label, some in the label of the surrounding regions, and some actually give it a separate label. So I just want to point that out. So in the next slice, actually, if I outline this, it looks more or less like this. But what you see here is actually that this portion contains a lot of pretty bright voxels. And I think that's actually cerebral spinal fluid in the hippocampal sulcus. So I don't think that's all dentate gyrus. And I think dentate gyrus is actually only probably this portion. And then going one slice further anterior, I don't think there's anything left. You can see the hippocampal sulcus and the dark band here, but I don't think there's any space for dentate gyrus voxels in the middle. So going in the opposite direction, I can again follow the dark band here. And then inwards here. Again, I think this is alveus going all the way inwards, and then the gray matter is wrapping around it. So I think this is more or less the outline of the dentate gyrus. One slice further posterior. Same thing. So sometimes it's also helpful to just outline in your head the midpoint of the gray matter. Like this. So then the dark band should fall somewhere within this outline. So again, I'll follow kind of the midpoint of the dark band here. It's slightly more faint here, but I think I can still see it. So one slice further posterior, same thing. Actually, try that again. And same thing. You can see how thin this upper layer of CA gets. This slice, this is pretty much over segmented, so just want to adapt that. The same for this slice, following the dark band. And you can see the dark band to here. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it might be going like this. You can pretty clearly see it up to this point. So I think it's probably going like this. So on the next slice, I think, again, I see some voxels there. And then the next slice, I'm not so sure if I see anything in the uncle region, but I do see this dark band. And I think this may actually be separated. I would not necessarily segment dentate gyrus in this region, but again, that depends on your protocol. So then next slice, again, I would go through the midpoint. And I think actually the SRLM stops here. So for the rest, I would just go like this for now and accept it. But then this portion of the border of dentate gyrus and adjacent regions needs to be adjusted, but that can be adjusted based on the segmentation protocol that you're using. Just for now, I just continue this line, and then at a later point, if you're segmenting the other subfield, you can adjust it. So the next slice, a body slice, you can see the dark band here. It's not super clear here, but I think this is more or less it. This would be the end point, so basically I would just go to the medial point here and then just finish the outline, and then again this would be adapted later. So next slice, again dark band here. You see something here, I'm not sure which one would be the most correct. I think this is slightly more continuous with this upper part, so that's why I'm picking that portion. And again, you can a bit more clearly see it, but the SRLM is stopping at this point. So again, I would just go to the medial point here and then finish it like this and then adapt it later. So this is more or less how I would segment it in the hippocampal body. I can do one more example. Follow the dark band here, stops here, just go to the medial point here and then finish it and then adapt this portion of the border later. So that's more or less how I would segment the dentate gyrus in the hippocampal body and head. I personally don't segment the dentate gyrus in the hippocampal tail, so that's why I'm gonna stop right here. So similarly as for the outer outline, I would first outline the dentate gyrus and then go through each slice to improve my segmentation and correct some small errors that I made. And I would actually recommend doing that for each label separately, and so you won't get distracted. So if you, for example, are working on the dentate gyrus, it's helpful if the outline of the whole hippocampus is already clean, so it doesn't distract you if there are any mistakes in there. Okay, that was all I had to say for today. I hope it was helpful, and thank you for listening.